Clarity Clinical Solutions.
How much should you pay someone to participate in a clinical trial? Pay too little, and you may not be able to recruit enough participants. Pay too much, and you might be accused of coercion, luring people into studies they would otherwise avoid. Finding the balance between fair compensation and undue influence is one of the most debated ethical questions in clinical research today. Compensation for clinical trial participation matters for several reasons. First, it acknowledges the time, effort, and inconvenience that participants contribute: travel costs, time off work, childcare arrangements. Second, fair compensation can improve diversity by enabling people from lower-income backgrounds to participate. Third, poorly designed compensation can create ethical problems, either exploiting participants by paying too little or coercing them by paying too much. Getting it right is essential for ethical and equitable research. It is important to distinguish three types of payments. Reimbursement covers out-of-pocket expenses: travel, parking, meals, lodging. This is not controversial. It simply ensures participants are not financially harmed by participating. Payment is compensation for time and effort, an hourly wage similar to what participants might earn in a job. Incentive is extra payment designed to encourage enrollment, and this is where ethical concerns arise because high incentives can override a person's better judgment about risks. The ethical framework for trial compensation rests on four principles. First, respect for persons. Participants should be compensated fairly for their contribution, not exploited. Second, beneficence. Compensation should not create excessive risk by blinding participants to danger. Third, justice. The benefits and burdens of research should be distributed fairly across populations. Fourth, voluntariness. Consent must be free from undue influence or coercion, meaning participants can say no without losing something important. Types of compensation vary widely. Per-visit payments are most common, typically ranging from $25 to $200 per visit depending on the invasiveness and duration. Flat payments give participants a lump sum at completion. Staged payments release portions at milestones to encourage retention. Some trials offer non-cash compensation like free medical care, medication after the trial ends, or gift cards. Each type has different ethical implications for coercion and fairness. Undue influence occurs when an excessive offer overwhelms a person's ability to make a reasoned decision about risks. This is especially concerning for economically vulnerable populations. If the payment represents a large portion of someone's income, they may accept risks they would otherwise refuse. The line between fair compensation and undue influence depends on the participant's circumstances, not just the absolute amount. What is reasonable compensation for a middle-class professional might be coercive for someone living in poverty. Regulatory guidance on compensation comes from the Common Rule, FDA regulations, and ICHE 6 Good Clinical Practice. The Common Rule requires that consent be sought under circumstances that minimize the possibility of coercion or undue influence. Specific guidance from OHRP and FDA emphasizes that compensation should be proportional to the time and inconvenience involved, not to the riskiness of the study. Paying people for taking risks is considered ethically problematic because it could be seen as purchasing their consent to be harmed. Fairness across populations is a major concern. Historically, clinical trials have under-enrolled minority and low-income populations. Adequate compensation can help address this disparity. But there is also concern that the same compensation may be unfairly coercive for some groups while being too little for others. Some argue for tiered compensation based on participant income, though this raises its own ethical questions about fairness and discrimination. Standardizing compensation across sites while accounting for local economic conditions is a practical challenge. The debate between paid and unpaid participation reflects different views on what motivates research volunteers. Some argue that participation should be altruistic, that paying people commodifies the body and undermines the gift relationship in research. Others counter that requiring altruism unfairly burdens those who cannot afford to volunteer their time. In practice, most trials offer some compensation, and the debate has shifted from whether to pay, to how much and under what conditions. The consensus is that payment should compensate for time and burden, not for risk-taking. 3 best practices for ethical compensation. First, base payment on time and burden, not on risk. Tying payment to risk level could be seen as buying consent to be harmed. Second, describe compensation clearly in the consent form, including the amount, schedule, and conditions for partial payment if the participant withdraws early. Third, use IRB review to evaluate whether the proposed compensation creates undue influence for the specific population being recruited, considering local economic conditions and participant vulnerability. First, compensation must balance fairness and voluntariness, pay enough to respect participants' time and contribution, but not so much that it overrides their judgment about risks. Second, payment should be based on time and burden, not on risk level. Tying compensation to risk is ethically problematic. Third, the same payment can be fair for one person and coercive for another. IRBs should evaluate compensation in context of the specific population being recruited, not in absolute terms. So, what is fair compensation in clinical trials? It is payment that respects participants' time and contribution without being so large that it overrides their judgment about risks. The key principles are: pay for time and burden, not for risk. Describe compensation clearly in the consent process. And evaluate fairness in context. The same amount can be appropriate for one population and coercive for another. The goal is not to avoid paying participants, but to compensate them fairly without undermining the voluntariness of their consent.